Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another Midnight Mirage episode. And this will be a thought experiment for the people out there, the men and women. So not only for this video, but all videos, I want you to have your thinking cap on, and I want you to contemplate deeply on the things that we're going to analyze in this video. And in your own life, in your own space and time, maybe you can spark up conversations regarding this subject with some of your peers, all right? So in the prior video, we talked a little bit about the Mazzini-Rothschild network connections and how the secret societies instigated the Civil War in North America, okay? And although we know that the indigenous people of America were fighting for their own reason and the foreigners were fighting for their reasons, but by the end of the video, not only myself, but maybe some of you even, you had a question, all right? Now, the first thing that I want to say is that when it comes to evaluating history, you cannot be arrogant, all right? You got to be humble when you're dealing with history, because a lot of the times you won't have the smoking gun. You won't have the empirical evidence. We were not around back then to know exactly what happened, all right? So you can't beat yourself up by, wanting this primary source so you can get to exactly what happened, because the truth is that a lot of the historical records have been altered and changed for political reasons, propaganda reasons, and just a lot of time has passed on, and certain information may have been lost, especially when it comes to a chronological sequential order. So we're doing our best here in 2024 to put the pieces of the puzzle back together. And we're going to do little by little, and we're going to do the best we can. We're going to be patient with ourselves, and we can't beat each other up either, all right? The truth is that a lot of the people in the so-called black conscious, American paradigm, I'll say. I'm not going to even call it a movement, but paradigm. You're going to have to put a lot of the information together. So a lot of the stuff that the so-called Moors are saying, you're going to have to put that together with what the so-called Hebrew Israelites are saying. And what the Hebrew Israelites are saying, you're going to have to put that with what the so-called black Muslims are saying. And what the so-called black Muslims are saying, you got to put that with the red, black, and green, or the Egyptologist people. And with the Egyptology people, you're going to have to put that with the people that have the understanding that our people were indigenous to America. So all the information has to be put together. You have to get all of it and put it in like this gumbo pot and mix it up together, all right? And that's going to give you somewhat of a better picture. And it will help us answer some of these very mysterious questions that we have, okay? Now, one question that I often wonder is, if people of a pale complexion, whether they be, converts into Judaism or converts into the various branches of Christianity, we all know that originally there were a copper-colored people, a people of color, a so-called black people, a swarthy complexion people, or original people of the planet that look like so-called black people. We know that they did initiate all civilizations on all continents, and they are the mothers and fathers of all cultures. So if that is the case, how did these Caucasian people come into prominence? And when the people in so-called black America failed, who did they really fall to? All right. So we're going to kind of even analyze that question a little bit. And, as I contemplated on my own, I just want to share something with you real quick. So what we're looking at right now is how did the original Americans, how were they made prisoners of war? Because we do know that there were a series of wars that happened on this land. You have the Seminole Wars of the 1800s. You have the Creek Wars of the early 1800s. You have the Gullah Geechee Wars. You have the Yamasee Wars. You have your Tuscarora Wars. You have your Cherokee Wars. You have your Iroquois Wars. So you have a lot of wars that were between the indigenous people of the land and the foreigners that were now trying to occupy or colonize the land. Okay. So we're going to look a little bit into, the who's who of these situations. All right. And you just take this information and you do with it what you may please, however you see fit. OK. So the first thing to understand, you're going to have to understand the old I'll call it a strategy of power, which is known as the cat's paw. In order for you to understand everything that we're about to talk about in this video and why I come to some of the conclusions that I come to, you're going to have to understand the old trick of what's known as the cat's paw. So let's read about what the cat's paw is. And if you want to know about the cat's paw, it's something that you can put in Google. It don't got to be anything too cryptic or special. You just want to get an understanding of what is the cat's paw. All right. So cat's paw, a person who is used by another to carry out an unpleasant or dangerous task. I'm going to repeat it one more time. Cat's paw, a person who is used by another to carry out an unpleasant or dangerous task. And in the example, by using the word cat's paw in it, so you can get a context of what the word means, it says he was merely a cat's paw of older and cleverer men. That's the example it gives. He was merely a cat's paw of older and cleverer men. So if you ever hear that term, a pawn in the game, that is another synonym of the cat's paw. Now, where I first heard about the cat's paw, it came when I was, years and years ago. But when I came across the book 48 Laws of Power, and it had a lot of different, strategies and tactics and philosophies and wisdom in it. But it gave a story about the old African proverb, which is basically an old proverb, an old tale of wisdom that original people of the planet created to try to teach others a particular concept. And in the story, it talked about the cat's paw, and it talked about it was a monkey. And this monkey was very, very hungry. And there was a certain type of fruit that the monkey wanted. But in order for the monkey to get it, the fruit was on top of these burning hot coals. So every time the monkey, knew that he would reach for it, it would be very, very hot. And he would burn his hand. So the monkey had to come up with a strategy to be able to get the fruit off of the burning coal, but not hurt himself at the same time. So what the monkey did was he went to the cat and he convinced the cat that if the cat helped him, that he in return would help the cat with something, right? So believing this, the monkey then took his hand and he placed it on the wrist of the cat, and he used the cat's paw to scrape the fruit off of the hot coals. And once the fruit was off, the monkey got it and then he ran off and he deceived or tricked the cat. So that's where you get that term, the cat's paw, comes from. And the cat was actually the one who was deceived in this. The cat was the pawn. The cat is the one that was fooled and that was used to do the unpleasant or dangerous task. Okay. So now in our example of history, we want to know, was there a cat's paw involved in denationalizing the indigenous American people? Was there a cat's paw involved in giving us the African slave trade narrative? We want to know if the people that attacked us and put us in the state that we're in today, did they do it directly or did they use a proxy to do it? All right. Meaning, or did they use somebody else to do their bidding for them? All right. Now, as I said, I just named you all a lot of different wars that happened here in the Americas. OK, so our people, perpetually fought against foreigners. All right. And even what they call the so-called slave revolts, these also were, situations where you can clearly see our people never laid down. We never gave up, basically. And the United States military used a lot of resources and damn near could have went bankrupt trying to clean out the indigenous Americans of the South so they could come in and take the territories, right? So if you're going to be fighting the people that won't give up, right, you got to figure out another strategy to be able to save resources and still meet your objective, okay? So now the next thing that we're going to look into, as you're going to keep the cat's paw in mind, the question we're going to ask is this: are so-called black crypto Jews behind some of these situations? Are so-called black crypto Jews behind some of these situations? And I'm going to go into why I say that. So when I'm talking about the so-called crypto black Jew, I'm talking about what you all know of as the dirty Moor. Okay. So in order to understand this, what I'm going to do is read to you all different names that some of these crypto so-called black Israelites probably go by. And some of the names that you see show up in historical books and references. But I believe that these people are hidden and they are behind the scenes and they work through the cat's paw. They are the monkey and they have a cat that they're using to do their dangerous task. Okay. So when I'm talking about the so-called dirty Moors, what I'm really talking about are crypto so-called black Israelite Moorish bloodlines of Europa. Let me say that one more time. When I'm talking about the so-called dirty Moors, like when you all hear that, especially in this, modern YouTube era that we in, and when a lot of people who, have an understanding that they may have indigenous ancestry in America, but when they start to, try to unravel, well, who were the people that we were rivaling against that, we were fighting against, they use this catch-all term called the quote-unquote dirty Moors, right? And what I've seen that do is it has misled a lot of people to think that if somebody has either, been labeled that title Moor, that they may be one of these so-called dirty Moors or people that were antagonistic. And another thing that I also see too is that a lot of the people that are indigenous to America, I'm seeing a lot of fighting and a lot of, animosity towards the swarthy melanated people of Europa. Okay. And although some of these so-called dirty Moors were part of that group of those people that were exiled from Europa, all of those melanated people were not a bad people. So when you think about the Moorish people coming from Europa and the various countries of Europa, the melanated swarthy people of Europa, the so-called black European, you got to understand that some of them were hostile and some of them were favorable. And not all of them were part of these so-called dirty Moors, okay? So some of these so-called dirty Moors, meaning that these are crypto so-called Jews that are from Israelite families, bloodline Israelite families, Shemitic. And they have been living in Europa, whether that be Southern Europe or whether that be Central or Northern so-called Europe. We're going to go through some of the names and titles that they go by. The Marranos, okay? The word Marrano is talking about the so-called black Jews that were living in Southern Europe, that were living in the Iberian Peninsula that we know of as Spain and Portugal. And during the so-called Spanish Inquisition, you had the Catholic Church, which at this time period still had melanated people involved. But the Catholic Church was started to kick out a lot of the other cultures and religions so they could have a certain prominence and power throughout Europa. And part of this cleansing is to get a lot of the melanated Israelites who still were practicing that culture to get them out of Europe. All right. So what happened is that a lot of the people were forced to either convert into Catholicism, and some of them became Jesuits, or they had to leave. OK. And a lot of the ones that left, they went into certain Islamic countries because under the banner of Islam, it didn't necessarily matter if you were an Israelite or a Christian. Under the banner of Islam, the Muslims, the Christians, and the so-called Jews over in Europe, in Northwest Africa, and the so-called Middle East, they could all kind of live in harmony together, okay? Now, when I'm talking about traditional Islam, traditional Christianity, and traditional Judaism, I'm talking about the religion and the cultures of Europa, Northwest Africa, and the Levant. As far as the indigenous Americans, we have our own separate form of spirituality, and we have our own understanding of all that. So both melanated people, but right now we're really talking about the ones that came from the eastern part of the Atlantic, okay? So that's who the Marranos are, all right? These are so-called crypto Jews that converted into Catholicism, and they became Catholics. They became conquistadors, and they would call themselves Spaniards, but really behind closed doors, they still were practicing ancient Judaism, okay? But they called them crypto because they were secret so-called Jews, okay? The Sabbatean-Frankist. Sabbatai V is a man who was living in Turkey, and in the year 1666, he proclaimed himself to be the so-called Jewish Messiah, all right? And what he was doing was using a lot of Cabalistic and Zohar traditions and certain Rosicrucian Freemasonic traditions. And he was fusing that also into, Torah practice. So during the time of Sabbatean V, you had a lot of Orthodox Israelites throughout Europa who were noticing, hey, wait a minute, they're using a certain type of Judaism that is very antagonistic, and in the root of it is satanic. In other words, they are heretical Jews. They are heretical Israelites, okay? And what happened was that some of the leadership of Islam, they told Sabbatean V, they said, look, you know, you're stirring up all this stuff about you being the new so-called Jewish Messiah, so we're going to give you one or two choices. Either we're going to cut your head off or you're going to convert into Islam. And all his followers were watching to see what Sabbatean V decided to do. And in his infinite wisdom, Sabbatean V, he converted into Islam. And some of his followers also converted into Islam. But behind closed doors, they still were practicing the Kabbalah. And they still were practicing the Babylonian sex rites of ancient Chaldea, ancient Ur, ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Egypt, ancient Canaan. And they still worshiped Saturn. So in a prior video, you've heard me talk about the crypto-Saturnians. That comes from this group of people. And they did this in Turkey. So in Turkey, what you have is you have a certain branch of people that in the public, they look like they are Islamic. They wear Islamic clothing. They pray like Muslims and they do everything else as Muslims. But behind closed doors, they really are crypto Jews. And they come from some of these, we'll say, heretical Israelite Sabbatean bloodlines from the early into mid 1600s. Okay. Another man by the name of Jacob Frank, who was from Poland, I will believe. He, a couple of decades later in the 1700s, said that he was the reincarnation of Sabbatean V. And he basically picked up the baton where Sabbatean V left off. So when it comes to this Cabalistic practice that is associated with the occult and associated with Saturn worship and also the sex rites of Babylon, this comes from the Sabbateans and the Frankists. And later on, these people teamed up with the Rothschild family and a few other these Rosicrucian families in Europe. And they created what's known as the Bavarian Illuminati, or the so-called Illuminati. Okay. So sometimes when you hear me say Sabbatean-Frankist, I'm also talking about the people that helped start the Illuminati. All right. And a lot of these people were tied with the Rosicrucians. All right. Now I'll go into the Rosicrucians in a minute. Well, I'll go into them right now. So the Rosicrucians are basically Christian mystics. And the mythology is said to where when the Knights Templars went to the Holy Land, went to Jerusalem in the so-called Middle East during the Holy Crusades, that they came across certain men who referred to themselves as Eastern mystics. And these men taught them the Kabbalah, and they taught them other Persian rites and other Babylonian magic. And the Knights Templars then took this system back up into Europe, and they created what we know of as Rosicrucianism and Freemasonry, Scottish Rite Freemasonry, and the other branches of Freemasonry. Okay. But as far as where did the people of Europe, where did they get the system of Kabbalah? Who taught them in the modern era? And the truth is that a lot of them learned it from the Muslims that were from Southern Europe, Northwest Africa, the Levant. And a lot of these Muslims, believe it or not, they were heretical Muslims, meaning that in the public, they were practicing Islam. In the public, they would pray 5 times a day, but behind closed doors, they would practice the Kabbalah, and they will worship the Baphomet, the goat-headed god, the god of Mendes that comes from ancient Mizraim, which is the ancient Hamitic god, also known as Pan by the Grecians. All right. So understand that there is a connection between heretical Israelites and heretical Muslims. OK. The heretical Israelites that converted into Islam, they're known as the Donmeh in Turkey. And I believe you spell that Donmeh. That's Donmeh, Donmeh, the Donmeh of Turkey. And those were the followers of Sabbatean V that converted into Islam. But behind closed doors, they really were crypto so-called Jews, and they were practicing Satanism. All right. Another term that you all know of as the synagogue of Satan. All right. Now, the term synagogue of Satan, as far as I'm concerned, it goes back to Revelation, I want to say chapter 2, verse 9, when the prophet Yahushua is speaking to some of the leadership that's in Judea. And he tells them that I know of your ways, I know of your greed, and basically that I know that you are of the synagogue of Satan. So what the prophet Yeshua was helping us see is that even during his day, you had a certain heretical leadership in Israel who were part of the upper crust, the elite, because they were in Jerusalem. But they professed themselves to be holy people, but behind closed doors, they were not. These were the ones in my prior tape when I talked about the Venetian bankers. And I talked about how the Israelite people were practicing usury, and how when the prophet Yeshua or the prophet Jesus, when he went in the temple and he was turning over the money tables, and then when you had Caiaphas and those other rabbis that were with him, and they conspired with the Romans to try to attack the prophet Yeshua, this is that synagogue of Satan. So we're talking about melanated people who practice not only certain Babylonian religion behind closed doors, but they are heretical, and they went against the true Messiah or the Israelite reformer, because that's really who Yeshua was. He just was trying to reform the religion. He wasn't creating anything new. He was just trying to bring it back to its original code, which was basically the golden rule, that you treat others the way that you want to be treated. He took the culture and just made it very, very simple and put it in its original principles, because the rabbinical class, they were trying to make everything very, very confusing and making it seem like if you didn't pray this way and if you didn't do things this way, that you aren't a real Israelite. And, and they were pressing the people. Kind of like today, where a lot of the Islamic countries are basically nothing but dogma now. Like when you take Saudi Arabia, for example, and some of these other so-called Islamic countries, how they sit back, for example, and they see what's happening to the Palestinians, and they can see also that, infusion of the Judeo-Christian occultists that have come into the so-called Middle East. They see it going on, but they still, just act like you got to be this good Muslim and stuff like that. All right, that's part of, the problem. Another term that I think these crypto so-called black Jews go by are the Jewish mafia. Now, yes, there may be a Caucasian Ashkenazim so-called Jewish mafia from Eastern Europe, Russia, Ukraine. I'm not saying that. But what I'm leading to is that they may have gotten their power and their start from the melanated ones. But we're going to continue. So remember when I talked about how the Knights Templars, when they came into the so-called Holy Land during the Crusades, and they learned from the Eastern mystics. Well, some of these so-called Eastern mystics were from the Brethren of Sincerity, or the Brotherhood of Sincerity, also known as the Ismailis or the Assassins. So now the question is, well, who are the Brethren of Sincerity or the Assassins? Who are these people? Who are these ones that actually teamed up with the Christian Knights Templars? But in the public, it seemed like they were all going to war. These people actually are a branch of heretical Muslims, okay? And a lot of them, and I'm not saying that all of them, but I'm saying there is a certain element of Sufism. There is a certain element of Wahhabism. There is a certain element of Salafism, I guess you can say. And there is a certain element of the Shia, which are into the occult. And they actually practice the Kabbalah. And a lot of the ancient religion that's coming from Persia and Iran, this is how it was infused and made its way into Islam. Remember, modern day Babylon is Iraq, and modern day Persia is Iran. Let me say that one more time. Modern day so-called Babylon, or at least in the Middle East, is Iraq, and modern day Persia is Iran. I want you to think about how in 9/11, during the early 2000s, under the Bush administration, that the United States military invaded where? Babylon, aka Iraq. What were they really doing there? And what were they looking for? And who were they there to meet up with to do business? And I want you to think about Iran. Now, Iran, they have a branch, because in Islam, you have your Sunnis on one side and you have your Shia. And basically the division comes from, after the Prophet Muhammad was deceased, the leadership. Some people thinking that the leadership should come from people in his family, and some thinking they should come from somewhere else. But what I want you to understand is that the majority of the Islamic world is Sunni, but you have a strong branch of Shia in Iran. And in Iran, you also have a strong Persian magical influence that stems over from the ancient Persian Empire. So although today they may be, modern Muslims and they may be Shia, but you also still have a certain Iranian magic or Persian magic influence. So a lot of these heretical Muslims, believe it or not, this is what they used to bring into Europe. They took that ancient Persian, Babylonian, ancient Iranian magic, and they infused that into some of the Islamic practices, and that's why they're seen as heretical by the Orthodox Sunni Islamic people, okay? Once again, we're still talking about the so-called crypto Jews, because remember, they were being attacked wherever they went, okay? So they would have to hide their identities most of the time. Another people that we want to talk about are, of course, your Scottish Rite freed and accepted Masons. We'll talk about that deeper in a minute. The Moorish Zionist Jews of New York in Harlem in the early 20th century. Who were those people really? Were those Aboriginal Indigenous Americans? Or were those melanated people from Europe? Your Venetian bankers, okay? Some of your ancient Israelite bloodlines coming from ancient Italy, okay? The Italians, the Etruscans. Originally, those were melanated people. The original people of Italy were a so-called black people. They were Hamitic, Shemitic, mixed people. Okay? So we talking about your bankers. Your slaveocracy of the Osman Ali Empire. All right? So think about how you had, what they call the Islamic slave trade or the Arab slave trade. The original people that started that, they were melanated people. And a lot of those melanated Moors or so-called melanated Muslims of the Osman Ali Empire, they worked with the Ashkenazi Jews in some of their slave campaigns. The Ashkenazi Jew, he acted as a slave broker, or he helped with marketing the slaves through his auctions. Okay, so you had a relationship between, once again, so-called Muslims and so-called Jews. Could they have both been crypto and originally melanated so-called black people? You have your slaveocracy of your Judean, European families who held slaves, Slovenians, Slavics, serfs. So think about how when the people from Europe came to the Americas and started the 13 colonies, they were a melanated people coming from Europe. And although they may have been calling themselves Protestant, aka crypto Jew, a lot of them already had pale Caucasians as serfs under the feudal system. So they were actually, brutalizing the pale Caucasian people of Europe through feudalism. All right. And they brought that system to the 13 colonies. So that was the slaveocracy right there. And also you have Yaqub. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. And you also have your crusaders or your conquistadors. And we all know that a lot of those were melanated crypto Jews who were navigators, and they helped come over and colonize the Americas and went to war with the indigenous Americans. Like Hernando de Soto, for example, that fought against the Mobilian people, that fought against the indigenous people of Alabama, Chief Tuscaloosa, in 1539, 1540. And I may have shown it before in certain videos, but I've seen pictures of Hernan Cortez and he looked like a so-called black man. So this is what we mean by so-called crypto Jews. Remember, the Marranos, these were Iberian Israelites or Israelites living in Southern Europe, but they forced them to convert into Catholicism. And a lot of them became Jesuits. All right, so just keep that in mind, okay? So the next thing I want to talk about is the use of the monkey's paw by the Moorish Synagogue of Satan. And I want to talk about how the Pale Arab or the Mameluke or the Janissary was the son of the Moorish harems and the human trafficking and the slavery of the blonde-haired or blue or green-eyed daughters of the Caucasus. So remember I talked about the slaveocracy of the Osman Ali Empire. A lot of history books leave out, especially here in the Americas, they leave out the influence of the Osman Ali or the Ottoman Empire, who had a lot of power in the 1500s, okay? And unfortunately, a lot of these Muslims, and some of them were crypto Jews under the Osman Ali Empire, they practiced slavery, okay? And what they would do is they would go into Eastern Europe and various places, and they would kill the men, and then they would capture these blonde-haired, blue or green-eyed women, and they would put them into the harems, okay? And a lot of these sultans, they wouldn't marry. They would just have children in the harem with the Caucasian Christian daughters of the Caucasus. All right. And the offspring of that became what we know of as Mamelukes or Janissaries. So that's where these Arab looking people come from. And what began to happen is that a lot of these Arabs, or these, these offspring of the dark skinned, we'll say melanated, dirty Moors, and the Caucasus daughters of Europa that they had enslaved, a lot of their sons became these Mamluk Arabs, and they went against their Moorish fathers, all right, who were both crypto-Jewish and Islamic. And that's, believe it or not, that's actually how the Sultanate changed, and how a lot of the pale Arabs of today got power in what we know of as like Egypt and the so-called Middle East. And they will let you know that those were Mamluk sultanates, all right? So in history, when you read about the Mameluke Sultanate, those are the sons of those dark-skinned Ishmaelites and Israelites that were under the Osman Ali Empire. Okay, that's who that is. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is how the Moorish synagogue of Satan, or some of these so-called dirty Moors, they would educate and raise up the lowly serfs and Mamelukes through the system of freed and accepted Masonry, Rosicrucianism, and the ancient rites of Babylon, Canaan, Sumeria. This is where the Ashkenazim converts of Europe and the Caucasian Anglo-Saxon Protestants converts got their power. They got their power from the so-called black nobility, and this also may be how the Ku Klux Klan, or the Knights of the Golden Circle, was started. So remember how in the prior tape about the Mazzini Rothschild network, we talked about how the Civil War was instigated, but that Albert Pike worked hand in hand with a Rothschild agent by the name of Judah B. Benjamin. I think his name was Judah P. Benjamin or Judah B. Benjamin. But there was a Rothschild agent by the name of Judah Benjamin. All right. And they said that he worked along with Albert Pike to reinstitute the various occult Palladian rites into Scottish Rite Freemasonry, and that they went out and created what we know of as the Knights of the Golden Circle, aka the Ku Klux Klan. And that was a terrorist group that was used to fight against the indigenous people of the South and to perpetuate the problem of so-called racism in the South. And this instigated what we know of as the so-called Civil War. But as I said, I've come across documentation that said that Judah P. Benjamin was Caucasian, Ashkenazim, and then I've come across documents that said he was a swarthy Moorish man. So what I really believe that it is that number one comes before number two. So Judah B. Benjamin more than likely was a melanated, swarthy, crypto Jew, Satanist, and the pale Ashkenazim are just the front man. They're just the monkey's paw. But behind closed doors, it really may be these so-called black elite of Europa that still are pulling the strings, and understand that they still had power because they still were financing. And we know that some of these foreigners wanted to put central banks in the Americas. All right. So just kind of keep that in mind. Now, the next thing that kind of, opened up my eyes to a lot of things is the catch-all general term Moor, all right, or Moorish. I've told you all before that, as far as I'm concerned, the term Moor or Moorish just meant a so-called melanated or a so-called black person, right? It didn't denote their culture. It didn't denote where they were from. It really didn't denote anything specific. But what you're going to find in most literature and most history records and books is that the indigenous people of the Americas are referred to as a Moor, and also the people of Europa are referred to as that. Okay, so let's take one for example. On the screen right here, you have a picture of Chief Saturia of Florida. All right, this is Chief Saturia of Florida. So in St. Augustine, Florida, the Timucua Kingdom, this was the chief of it, or the emperor. Okay, now most of us have seen this picture before. And if you Google right now, and I want you to do this so you can see that I ain't bullshitting, I want you to Google Moor with emerald clusters. I want you to Google Moor with emerald clusters. All right. Moor with emerald clusters. And you're going to see this image pop up, which is a very large statue. All right. And when you read about it, it'll tell you that This is the chief of Florida, Santeria, and that he's adorned in jewelry and has emerald clusters that actually are from South America. So they're showing you right here clearly in this statue that for one, they calling him a Moor. Two, he clearly looks like a so-called black man. And three, he doesn't look like a slave, so-called slave. And four, he has trade networks with South America because that's where the emerald clusters are coming from. So what I found is that the term Moor is just a catch-all general term. It's not specific really to our people. It was a word that more than likely was made up, probably in the last, let's say, couple 100 years to 1,000 years, as far as its usage, I'll say. But the indigenous Americans, our people here that are from the original inhabitants of the land and the tribes of America, as far as I'm concerned, the word Moor, the only way it really refers to us as it being, if it's a general word that just meant a melanated person, a so-called black man or a so-called black woman, in that context, yes. But when I looked up the word Amaru Maru, that went back to South America, and it went back to these original people that helped start these civilizations in South America, the Inca. When I heard the word Moor, and I know how in language arts, basic language arts, they teach you that vowels are interchangeable, right? So in the word Moor, the vowels are O-O, because the word is spelled M-O-O-R, right? So the consonants will be M-R, and the vowels will be the two O's, right? And vowels can be changed, but the word will essentially mean the same thing. So when I heard the word Amaru Maru, I knew that Meru was associated with the Americas. And I knew that Amaru Maru was associated with the ancient Inca. So I believe that that's why you will see certain historians use the word Moor to describe somebody that's from the indigenous Americas, that has never been from Europe, that's not a Muslim, that's not from Northwest Africa or the Middle East. Okay? Because another thing that you'll see, if you type in your Google search right now, this is another thing I want you to go type. I want you to go type in not only Moor with emerald clusters, and then what's going to pop up is this image, which is the emperor of ancient Florida. But if you type in Blackamoor Indian, if you type in the word Blackamoor Indian on Google, you're also going to get images just like this. You're going to find images of so-called black people that are wearing traditional original American attire, wearing feathers, you know what I'm saying? Wearing tobacco skirts, wearing jewelry. They look like what you would call an original American. But their ethnic phenotypes are of so-called black people, okay? So Chief Santeria of Florida, this man that you looking at, this person that they call him the Moor with the emerald cluster or the Blackamoor Indian, these are the ancestors of the modern day so-called black American or the original American. So the so-called black American is originally from America. They were here when the melanated Europeans got here. They were here when, the so-called Muslim and Israelite traders from so-called West Africa came here. And anybody else that came here, we were already here. So America is a so-called Negro or a so-called black continent, but so-called black Americans. So we are already at home. You know what I'm saying? This is our motherland. We at home, but don't let that word Moor trick you. All right. Because that word Moor is helping you understand that there's a difference between the indigenous American and the melanated European, because both of us can be referred to as a Moor, but we come from different tribes, different bloodlines, different cultures, different groups. But our ethnicities are like cousins. We look similar to them. They come from a so-called Negroid or a Shemitic or a so-called black original stock, I'll say. But that don't make them the same people as us. So a lot of these swarthy crypto Jews that came to the Americas that were calling themselves Protestants, these are some of these so-called dirty Moors that they're talking about. You know what I'm saying? So the people of Europa, they refer to them as Moor, and some of the indigenous American, they would call them a Blackamoor Indian. Now, did the indigenous people in America refer to themselves as a Moor or a Blackamoor Indian? More than likely not. Because like I said, the word Moor is kind of like a general term. But nevertheless, that's what we're dealing with. Once again, we still looking at Who were the indigenous Americans in conflict with? So now we can understand you got your monkey and you got your cat. We want to know who was the monkey, because the monkey is who we're battling. We don't want to know who the cat's paw is, because the cat's paw is who has been put in front of us. That's the one that we have to look at when we get mad and we think that they the problem. But it's really the cat, it's the monkey behind the cat that's using his paw. Another thing we want to think about is the ancient bloodlines of the Shemitic Israelites in Europe who rebelled against the Torah during the time of Babylonian captivity. Some of these Israelites infused Babylonian astrology, the worship of Baal or Lucifer or Satan, and Chaldean Persian magic into the original Shemitic Abrahamic practices. All right. So these are your so-called Jews that created the Kabbalah. Now, those of us that are familiar with biblical history, we know that the Israelites, I believe around 590 some BC, they say that Judah was sacked by the Babylonians and Nebuchadnezzar, and that they were put into captivity in ancient Babylon. And while they were in ancient Babylon, when we look into the Quran, we're going to find out that while they were in ancient Babylon, that they were given the opportunity to learn Satanism, and that some Jews decided to do it, and they threw the Torah behind their back. So when we're talking about the synagogue of Satan that were in Europa, when we're talking about the Illuminati, when we're talking about the Sabbatean-Frankist, when we're talking about the Dome, when we're talking about the Knights Templars and the Palladian rites, the worship of Baphomet, all of that stuff that happened in Europe had an origin when the Shemitic Israelites, the melanated original ones, were in Babylonian captivity. And while they were in Babylonian captivity, this is when they had an advanced education on astrology. This is when they started to expand their worship of the dying God, which they had learned in ancient Canaan, which was before that, the worship of Baal. This is when they started to create a new system. And this is when they created ultimately what's known as Kabbalah, because Kabbalah is basically, it's a Luciferian at its core. It's a Luciferian doctrine, which basically says that man is God and that the original God is actually the enemy. So when you think of Gnosticism is also a form of Kabbalah, because what do they teach in Gnosticism? They teach that the original God had Adam and Eve as servants in the garden, and that the serpent was the great liberator, right? That's what they teach. So when I say these are Kabbalists or Sabbatean-Frankists, I'm also saying that they are Gnostics, meaning that they believe in the opposite doctrine as you. So whereas you read the Garden of Eden and you see that the God Almighty, the Creator, as the source, the Satanists see the serpent or the antagonist, the adversary, they see that as the source. So where you see that the tree of knowledge of good and evil was meant to, preserve them and deal with the tree of life, the Satanists see the garden of the tree of knowledge of good and evil as God trying to keep knowledge from them. So a lot of these occult orders and these Freemasons, they have a Gnostic doctrine, meaning that they believe in the reverse aspect of the Bible. And their playbook is the book of Revelations. The book of Revelations is their Cabalistic playbook. That is the playbook that they're using to accelerate what they deem to be the arrival of the Antichrist. All right. So they think that they have to actually commit events and make things happen in order to force the Antichrist to have to come to earth, or to force the Christ Messiah to have to come to earth. So this is where you get events like, and I'm going to just give this example, but this is where you get things like 9/11 from. Like a lot of what they call these hoaxes. When they say it's a hoax, they're not saying that people didn't die. No, people died in 9/11. Those buildings really came down. Those planes really went inside those buildings. But as far as how the event happened and the narrative that they give us, that's not real. That's staged. It was constructed by people behind closed doors. You know how they say things like, for example, that so-called Jewish people didn't show up that day to work? Or you have other examples of it. They'll say that the people that owned the building had taken out an insurance premium on it, And then you hear other examples that people say, well, the buildings were really blowing up from the bottom up, so somebody set off a detonator. All these backstories you get in basically are trying to let you know that this is not a natural organic event. It didn't just naturally happen. You know what I'm saying? So let's continue. All right. So the next thing that I want to talk about briefly is, as I said, while these later on, they will become crypto Jews, but their ancestors, these melanated original Israelites, during Babylonian captivity, this is where they learned the Kabbalah. Okay. And remember, the Ashkenazim Caucasians who were converted into Judaism, they learned Kabbalah as well. And they're very, very, attached to the Talmud. Okay. And what is the Talmud? The Talmud is basically nothing other than what Caiaphas and some of those dirty rabbis were using to go against the prophet Yeshua. All right. So let's read about the Israelites in the Quran, because the Quran is also what gave me the key to some of these crypto Jews and the history of them, really. And the history is coming from Surah 2, verse 101 and 102, and we'll read it. So in the Quran, in Surah 2, verse 101, it says, now remember that when Islam was, revealed, we'll say, through quote unquote Prophet Muhammad, there were already Shemitic Israelite people living in the so-called Middle East. But remember, they had corrupted the religion. So when Islam came on the scene, it really was just trying to reform the original religion of Abraham and Shem. That's all it was. It really was nothing new. Because the Prophet Muhammad, believe it or not, he was learning from a lot of the Israelites that were surrounding him. Okay? So what a lot of the people that were Muslims understood is that there were a certain heretical Israelite that actually caused their people to fall. So it wasn't all of them. It was a little group of them. And let's read what it says. So in Surah chapter 2, verse 101, it says, now when a messenger from Allah has come to them, confirming their own scriptures, some of the people of the book cast the book of Allah behind their backs as if they did not know. So what this is saying right here is that when the messenger of Islam, meaning the Prophet Muhammad or whoever those people were, when they started to interact with the people of the book, aka the Shemitic Israelites around them, the Muslims were trying to confirm or, help these Israelites understand some of these corruptions that they had made in their own religion. And whether they knew it was right or wrong, they ignored these new people that were trying to show them what the truth was. Because remember, like I said, the rabbis, when they left from Babylon, they infused Kabbalah and Gnosticism, magic and astrology, and the worship of Lucifer or the dying god Baal. They had infused that into the Torah practices. And then, hundreds of years went by. So those Israelites of the day of Muhammad, they thought that what they were practicing was the right thing. But they were not. And when they were made aware of what the right thing was, they said, you know what, we ain't into that. And that's why it says here that they threw the book of Allah behind their back as if they did not know. That's why you have a lot of so-called Jews today, and they say that Islam is a fake religion. And you have a lot of so-called Christians that say that too. In verse 102, it says, they instead followed the magic promoted by the devils during the reign of Solomon. Never did Solomon disbelieve. Rather, the devils disbelieved. They taught magic to the people, along with what had been revealed to the two angels, Harut and Marut, in Babylon. The two angels never taught anyone without saying, we are only a test for you, so do not abandon your faith. Yet people learned magic that caused a rift between husband and wife, although their magic could not harm anyone except by Allah's will. They learned what harmed them and did not benefit them, although they already knew that whoever buys into magic would have no share in the hereafter. Miserable indeed was the price for which they sold their souls, if only they knew. So what this is talking about is talking about that group of Israelite rabbis and leadership that were living in a time of ancient Persia, ancient Babylon, ancient Iran. Because remember, the Israelites were living under the Persians with Darius. And it's talked about how some of those Israelites, they changed the religion. So once they did that, they came and they started to distribute this new religion, which included the Talmud, the Kabbalah, and some of that other stuff. So it says that they instead followed the magic promoted by the devils during the reign of Solomon. When it says they instead, that they're talking about are these rabbinical Jewish leaders, okay? The priests, the leadership of Israel. They were the ones that followed the magic that was promoted by the devils or the Satanists. Because remember, there were Satanists during those days. You know what I'm saying? There were Satanists during the time of ancient Babylon. There were Satanists during the time of ancient Iran. There were Satanists during the time of ancient Chaldea. There were Satanists during the time of ancient Canaan and ancient Egypt. There were Satanists during the time of ancient Rome. They just didn't call them Satanists. Satan is a word that we're using today. Satan, shaitan, which means adversary or the enemy. But you had adversarial doctrines practiced since the beginning of time. Like when Sumerian tablets talk about Enki and Enlil, and they talk about these two brothers feuding. And you have these different bloodlines that are on the earth that come from these original people. You know what I'm saying? So you've always had this war, we'll say, between, you know, the righteous and the satanic. And it says that these evil rabbis, that they taught the magic to the people, and they learned this in Babylon. All right. And it goes on to say in the last part, it says that they learned what harmed them and did not benefit, although they already knew that whoever buys into magic would have no share in the hereafter. Now, how would the Israelite rabbis have known that? They would have known that because during the days of Moses, when they were given the Torah and they were given the laws of Deuteronomy, the laws in Exodus, and the laws of Leviticus, the Israelites were told to stay away from black magic. The Israelites were told to stay away from child sacrifice. The Israelites were told to stay away from the worship of Baal. Because remember when Moses and Joshua kept telling the people, when we go into ancient Canaan, do not take on the religion of the Canaanites. Because the Canaanites were passing their children through the fires of Baal. They were practicing the sex rites of Ashtaroth. But when the Israelites went in there, some of them got engaged in that. So that's why in the Quran it says that they already knew that whoever buys magic will have no share in the hereafter, but yet they did it anyway. So what we're talking about, a heretical group of Israelites that were melanated, because all these people we're talking about that were original, these were so-called black people. Okay? They just were. All right. So we all know that the United States was created by Europeans. We all know the United States created by Europeans usurped the American land, colonized it, and made the original inhabitants prisoners of war. If we keep saying the quote unquote dirty Moors helped the Caucasian, why would the dirty Moors of Europe not still be in power and pulling the strings behind closed doors? Let me repeat that one more time. If we keep saying the quote unquote dirty Moors, who are really these crypto Jews that are calling themselves Protestant, they're calling themselves Christian, they're calling themselves Muslim, they're calling themselves whatever. If we keep saying that the quote unquote dirty Moors helped the Caucasian, why would the dirty Moors of Europe not still be in power and pulling the strings behind closed doors? So what it is this original conflict was between the so-called dirty Moors, or these crypto Jews, and the original American. So you had your so-called dirty Moor of Europa, the crypto Jewish Satanists that was melanated, going against the original American, or historically who they'll call the so-called Black or More Indian. So this was so-called Black Americans going against so-called Black Europeans. Just like Chief Satiria right here. When the people from Europe came here, this is who they was running across. And Chief Satiria was seeing people that looked like him, except they was calling themselves Christian and had a totally different culture. But as far as some of the ethnic features and the skin shades, they were similar. So these are some of the final remarks that I want you to contemplate on. In the comment section, I want you to leave a comment stating if you think the dirty Moors, aka the crypto Jews, are ruling in secret still. Why or why not? Remember, the Caucasian is not the original Etruscan or Roman. He's not the original Iberian. He's not indigenous to Europe. He is not the original Dorian, Athenian, Spartan, or ancient Grecian. All of these were so-called black people. So that's what you must think about. And that will help you understand who your enemy is. And that will help you understand the cat's paw. So these so-called pale Caucasian Jewish people and these Caucasian Anglo-Saxon Protestant Christians or Protestants, the Ku Klux Klan, these people that they show us that make us think that all they racist and all this other stuff. Not saying that they probably aren't, because they done got the battery put in their back. But what if I told you that deep in the center of the core, that the so-called black ruling elite still running this shit? And we're going to end it with that. So y'all stay tuned. Keep your eyes open. And we out.